Hi everyone, thank you so much for coming today. My name is Tara Spalding. I'm with Kinect Capital. And let me get the slides up. It's a pleasure for me to host you all today. Thank you so much for joining us in this very important education session, which we call the Kinect Essentials. First and foremost, I'd like to thank our sponsors who are running this event for us. Silicon Slopes have sponsored the entire Kinect Essentials program, and we get to broadcast this live from their amazing studio, again, in Lehi, Utah. Additionally, I'd like to thank all of our venture sponsors who support us. Also, today we are talking about due diligence. It's a very important aspect before investments are made that not only entrepreneurs but also investors experience. We have a due diligence material and available resources for you on the kinectcapital.org website. We also have a really cool learning app called Investment Due Diligence Basics. So if you scan this QR code or go to the URL, you can actually quiz yourself and see how you're doing and your knowledge when it comes to due diligence in itself. And this recording, in fact, will be hosted on this website as well as additional materials. I'd like to give a hello to our Boise, Idaho group. This is our first meetup where we have our lead mentor, Norris Kruger, running the event from Umpqua Bank. That's in downtown Boise. I'd like to give a shout out to Becky as well as Melanie for being our experts on staff. Thank you, Boise, for joining us. But today on the live stage to introduce what is Kinect Essentials in the due diligence process, we have Dan Roberts from Savvi Legal, Tara Rosander from Brandless, Sam Gardiner from Mayer Brown, Rick Haskell from Westminster, Braxton Savage from Tanner, and Rick Merrell from Salt Lake City Angels. If you're new to Kinect Capital, welcome. We are a 501c3. We focus on grooming entrepreneurs and preparing them and connecting them to the appropriate capital providers. We are a community of kinship. We love working with entrepreneurs. Most of our programs are free or very little cost. We also ask our community to get involved who have raised capital as a mentor or support our internship program. And of course, we work with various sorts of capital providers, from banks to corporate financing, and of course, VCs and angels. And of course, big thanks to our sponsors, our service providers, such as Savvi Legal, Mayer Brown, Tanner, who are here today. Our upcoming programs are really awesome. Just want to highlight a couple. This Friday, we're kicking off a Women Entrepreneur Angel Education Group called We Angels. Next week, we have an Urban Innovation Demo Day where 7 companies that have gone through our mentoring program are going to pitch to investors. It's open for all to participate. And then we're going to open our applications for Eastern Utah entrepreneurs to go through a cohort. Our We Angels 101 is actually a course of 9 sessions. Every Friday, we'll be hosting these events, and it'll end on September 1st. The last line item of note is the We Rock Conference and the We Golf Tournament. And this is September 5th, 6th, and 7th, where we'll be featuring up to 20 female CEOs that have gone through our education and mentoring program who will also be raising capital. I'd like to bring to the stage Dan Roberts, who is the CEO of Savvi Legal. Dan, thank you so much for backing us.
Thank you, Tara. I'm going to share a little bit about, before we dive into the due diligence essentials here, a little bit about Savvi and Paper OS. First of all, a little background about myself. My name is Dan Roberts. I've been a venture attorney for over 12 years. I'm an entrepreneur myself and also an investor. I've represented dozens of venture firms, actually worked in-house at a venture capital group, have represented hundreds of companies, know what it's like to go through diligence as an entrepreneur, as an investor, and as an attorney representing both sides. So really excited to partner with Kinect for this event. To talk a little bit about and give an introduction to due diligence, I want to talk a little bit about the democratization of venture. This has been a movement that has really popped off in the last few years. And what this means is you have more tools that are accessible to both the founders and to investors. And so what we see is that more startups are forming, as well as more investment groups are popping up. That gives you access to more relationships, more money, but that also results in more process, more records you have to keep track of, and that creates more problems. As you can see here, as a founder, you're using as many tools as you can get your hands on. You might be using DocuSign. You might be using Clerky, LegalZoom, Box, Dropbox, AngelList. There's a whole slew of tools out there for you as founders to get things done from the legal side. And keeping track of where everything's at is a problem. And so let's talk a little bit about that founder journey in this, let's see here. Well, we lost connection. There we go. Founder journey in the era of the democratization of venture. So you start out, you're bootstrapped, you go find a couple founders, and you start your company. It's pretty simple when you get going. You, a couple people, a couple clients, maybe one or two investors who are supporting you early on. And then you get to where you're pre-seed, and you're raising that friends and family round or the angel round. The complexity steps up very slightly. You have some more equity documents to keep track of, more client documents to keep track of, more employees, and more people on your cap table. And then you get to the Seed Plus or Series A round, and your complexity is stepping up even more. Finally, you've hit growth stage, and you're looking at maybe a potential exit. And you're at the point where you don't know where all your documents are, or if you do, they're not very well organized. And the due diligence is important for you. Keeping due diligence in mind is very important for you because this is going to precede you raising money or having any acquisition. And so due diligence is the gateway to any of those transactions. Very important for you to understand what goes on there. Understanding that as you increase in complexity, as your company increases in complexity, your due diligence costs are going to also increase because you have more things to keep track of. So the traditional diligence model is you get to a financing event or an acquisition, and you have to go and track everything down. Your investor's law firm is going to send you a checklist, and they're going to say, hey, show us all of this information. You're going to work with your law firm, try to track it down, build it into a data room, and it's going to be a very painful experience if you're not organized. I call this the due diligence scramble. As you can see, you're kind of going around and around this. Company law firm's doing work, putting together data room. Investor law firm is asking for more information. And all the while, the lawyers are billing. It's a necessary thing. Lawyers help you get the deal done. But the more disorganized you are, the more work they're going to have to do, and it's going to be costly. So introducing PaperOS. PaperOS is a life cycle corporate operating system. We provide you with automated transaction workflows to do different transactions. That can be anything from entity formation to a safe financing to a more complex preferred stock financing. We enable what we call an agile approach to diligence that differs from the traditional model. We have evergreen data rooms. As you're going through building your company, every time you send out a document, it's being added to your data room, so your data room is evergreen. We have integrated diligence checklists that if any point you want to know, what am I missing in preparation for a financing or an acquisition, you can go through a due diligence audit on the platform, and it can check to see what you're missing. And we're also giving you access to AI-enabled diligence tools that can look at your documents and tell you, hey, this is where you might have room for improvement. So that's PaperOS. We have also integrated services, so we integrate with law firms. So you're not just automating it on your own. You're not just going through an automated process on your own. You can actually get support from people who know and who have been through this before. And so you get access to lawyers, accountants, different service providers who can assist throughout these transactions. Whether you're forming your company or raising money, we can help out. The way it works is you get on our platform and there's different subscriptions. If you're a startup, very early stage, that subscription can be $500 or less per year. If you're going through a financing, it might be a little bit more. And so what we're offering is if you talk to anybody on our onboarding team, here's a QR code. You can schedule with somebody from our onboarding team. We're offering anybody here at the Kinect Capital event up to $1,000 off, 50% discount from a PaperOS subscription. And just, again, scan that QR code. You'll be able to talk to somebody from our onboarding team. If you can talk to us before the end of the month, you can get access to that discount. And anyway, we'd love to chat with you guys. Really excited to be here, like I said. And I'll turn the stage back over to Rick.
Thank you, panelists. If you'd go ahead and come on up, please. So I'd like to first start off by thanking Kinect Capital and Silicon Slopes and Savvi Legal for making this opportunity or this conversation about due diligence possible today. So my name is Rick Haskell. I'm a finance professor at Westminster University, but perhaps more important to our conversation today, I've been over the many years a very active participant in the private equity markets and in investment advisory. Today we have with us Tara Rosander from Brandless, Braxton Savage with Tanner, Rick Merrell with Salt Lake City Angels, and Sam Gardiner with Mayor Brown. And I've asked each of them to take just a few minutes and discuss, give a little bit of an introduction to themselves, but a much better job than I could possibly do. But also talk a little bit about their firm, their role, and what causes them to have the expertise in talking about due diligence that they have. We then have a series of questions that we're going to see to it that we get handled and go through our panelists and then kind of just open up a little bit more generally for discussion amongst us. So let's go ahead and take it in that order. So Tara, then Braxton, Rick, and then Sam. If you'll spend a few minutes talking about yourself, your perspective on due diligence, and then we'll start to deal with some actual questions.
Thank you, Rick. As Rick mentioned, my name's Tara Rosander, and I work with Brandless. Brandless is a multi-channel platform for wellness products. We focus on making you, your family, and the planet better through our products, and so we're also acquiring companies inside of that space. That's where my role comes in. I focus on the diligence and integration at Brandless. We've made 6 acquisitions to date, all within that ecosystem. And I lead out that diligence process. I actually personally really enjoy it. I know it can be tenuous for some of the entrepreneurs, but we try to make it as painless as possible. I love learning about the companies inside of that diligence process, and I really think as you think of going through a diligence process, you can think about introducing your company to someone else and really giving them a deep dive into what you've built. It's a fun process on our end.
Thanks, Tara. So I'm Braxton Savage with Tanner. We're a full-service public accounting firm. I specifically work in our transaction advisory practice. We've got the standard audit and tax services, but also have some other specialty services such as leadership consulting, IT consulting, et cetera. And so I manage a manager in our transaction advisory practice, and could talk for hours, I guess, on exactly what we do. But kind of specific to this is due diligence is what I do every day, basically, both on the buy side and the sell side. And so we'll kind of dig into that today with some of the questions. But I really enjoy what I do, just working with so many companies. We work with startups, looking for different rounds of raising, all the way down to selling founder-owned businesses that are ready for that next chapter. So yeah, thank you.
Thanks. My name is Rick Merrell. I'm the executive director of the Salt Lake City Angel Investment Group right here in Salt Lake City. I started my career, though, with the U.S. Air Force, my post-college career. So I guess that was really my first exposure to due diligence, because anytime we had to fly combat missions, I wanted to have a lot of data about what was going on, you know, what surface-to-air missiles the enemy had going, what air-to-air combat might look like as we flew this next mission. So that was really kind of my first exposure to wanting to know a lot about a lot, and that's really what due diligence is all about. I then spent some time at a Wall Street brokerage clearing firm, running and overseeing software development for that firm. I had to hire a lot of software consulting companies to help us get done what we needed to get done, and I didn't like any of them. So I decided I would step out and start my own software development company. It's called Agendas Technology. Did that 23 years ago. So I know a little bit about what it's like to be on the founder side. That's really my day job. And then about 3 years ago, I got involved with angel investing, and just in January took over as the executive director. And I've had the opportunity to see quite a bit of due diligence going on with my time at Salt Lake City Angels, and we'll get more into that later.
Thank you. I'm Sam Gardiner. I'm an attorney here in Salt Lake City. I've been practicing corporate transactional law for 26 years, and I've worked with a lot of companies and investors over all those years to either do many financing transactions, help companies get started and going, and then ultimately exit one way or the other, usually in an M&A transaction. I have in my career worked on IPOs and other public securities offerings and things like that. I'm currently at a law firm called Mayer Brown, which is an international firm with 27 offices and about 1,800 lawyers. They decided they wanted to open an office in Salt Lake in January of 2022 because they were just so excited about what was going on in our market with all the emerging companies that are here, Silicon Slopes, everything like that. So I was one of the first lawyers to join that office. We're now about 18 corporate lawyers in Salt Lake working primarily on companies and financings and exits here in our market. So and due diligence is key to all of that, and I've been living and breathing due diligence for 26 years. So look forward to talking more.
Well, thanks to each of you, and thank you for being here. You know, Braxton and I were speaking as we were waiting to start this afternoon, and on one hand, due diligence is a huge topic. We could have a 3-day conference with numerous simultaneous sessions, keynote speakers, evening discussions, and all, and we would barely scratch the surface. But on the other hand, it's just common sense, right? So there's a big gap between those things. And so what I'm hoping that we can tease out as we have a discussion then is how we bridge that gap and how we can think about the common sense and yet the extraordinarily heavily detailed documentation needed, et cetera. So Tara, I'd like to start with a question for you. What should we expect from a due diligence process? What information does the business owner need to provide? How should it be organized? And what kind of time does it take to go through due diligence?
Sure, thanks. So I think what you can expect is something different depending on what type of transaction you're looking for. And so if it's an angel investment, if it's a VC round, if it's an acquisition, they're all going to be structured just a little bit differently. But I feel like there's some basics that you can really rely on. And the first thing is that you'll get a due diligence checklist. So Dan already talked about this. It'll be sometimes a smaller list, sometimes a pretty expansive list, depending on what stage you're at. But all of that information can be kept in a data room. It sounds like Savvi has some fantastic tools for that. It can also be as simple as a Google Drive that you can be compiling along the way. So I'll talk about those documents in a minute, but the first thing that we do when we go into a diligence process is we have a kickoff call so that we can talk about what you can expect from that type of a process. And so in that kickoff call, we kind of introduce both what our goals are out of the transaction, get to know a little bit about each other, and then talk about what the expectations will be So typically we have a list that we go over in that, which is our due diligence checklist, and then we schedule a series of meetings. So information is being provided back and forth during that time period throughout the diligence process. And then we actually like to meet a couple of times a week, and sometimes we do them in an accelerated fashion, depending on what the deal timeline is. But as you'll be finding in the market right now, timing is extending. It's going to be a longer process. But at least a couple times a week, you'll be meeting with that team, going over some detailed information about your company or questions they have that come up in the diligence process. But everything's kind of getting funneled into that data room where you're going to be collecting that information. So from a timeline perspective, I think 18 months ago, maybe even 9 months ago, some of our competitors were doing deals within 45 days. You don't see that anymore right now because a lot's changed in the market and diligence is tightening. And so you can expect to have more scrutiny on your financials, more scrutiny on key metrics of the company, and then them wanting a little bit more time to just kind of see things play out in the market and see things play out with your company, making sure that you're going to meet some of those metrics that you've put in place. When you think about your data room, you can think about some core things that you'll want to keep in there, and you can keep them updated along the way. So Dan mentioned some evergreen tool that they have where you can save these in a process along the way. You should make that part of your system anyway. So always have a data room where you're keeping key financial information. So it should be your financials and your forecasts. If you're pre-revenue, you should have those forecasts set in place, and then kind of the timing along the way and what stages you're going to need funding along that way as well. You should have corporate entity information in there, any legal items that your investor or your acquirer should be aware of, employment agreements, supplier agreements, any major agreements that are put along with your company or that your company is tied to. They will have impact on the transaction. And also we think about, so when we're going into diligence, we kind of do this pre-diligence process, and we have these, I guess, an accelerated process where we go over the T's. So you go through traction, company traction, TAM, total addressable market, the team, whether it's transformative, so whether you have like disruptive nature in the market, your timing, what you need, when you need it, why you need it, and then the 10X factor, can we grow it? So those are the things that we focus on, and then as we get deeper into diligence, we go into growth drivers and team and channels, so more exhaustive list that Braxton's very familiar with because he's helped us in that process too. So I think that covers all of your questions.
But that wasn't a whole 3-day conference, so there's got to be a little bit more. So,
Yeah.
Sam and Braxton and Rick, you have some additional thoughts or comments to add into this. Please add in.
Well, I guess I would start with, every deal closes by the target deadline, right? Like, I've never seen a deal not. But I think it's just so key to, and that's kind of what I was going to get into as well, was, key being having everything prepared ahead of time. It just pays such dividends down the road. The software that Dan was talking about with Savvi, Tara talking about all of the different things you need to have in order. You'd be surprised by the things that people don't have readily available. Simple as a bank statement. Maybe your bank collapses and you happen to not be able to have access quickly to bank statements. You'd be surprised that we want to trace things down to to the bank. And so just having those things ready.
Well, I'll just make one quick comment. Deals have a pace, a cadence to them. They need momentum to get done. The process needs to get going and rolling and moving forward. And if a company is struggling on the due diligence side, either to provide information or find the accurate information, or if big problems come up that nobody's expecting in the due diligence review, it can severely impact that process. And it can hamper a deal, or it can make it sometimes so the deal doesn't happen. Deals need to keep moving and have momentum to go, and a smooth due diligence process is key to making that happen.
And I would foot stomp what Tara said about the data room. And I would just share with you two words: organized and updated. From an angel investor's standpoint, you're always being evaluated. Until we make the investment, we're trying to figure out whether we want to make an investment, which means an evaluation is going on. So your data room represents your company. So keep it organized. There's tons of checklists out there. You know, everybody's basically looking at the same type of data, financials, technology, et cetera. So have it nicely organized in folders in your data room so we can go in and look at it. And secondly, keep it updated. You're telling a story about your company and about you as a founder, and to have a data room opened up and go in and see financials that are 3 months old doesn't bode well. So keep it updated. Organized, updated.
Yeah. And I will say we require that you update it every month anyway, so just make that a part of your process anyway.
And Tara, as you talk about a data room, just to make sure we're all speaking the same language, you're not talking about a physical room. You're talking about a virtual space, right?
Right. It's something in the cloud.
Something out in the cloud. Very good.
The physical ones are actually my favorite. You know, go on site and sift through papers.
Yeah,
We
yeah.
used to do that.
Especially when they have mini bars and video games and those kinds of things in them, right?
That's right, yeah.
We're beyond that. We're
We
beyond
used to
that.
spend 7, 8, 10 days in one conference room reading, and there'd be binders lined up on the shelf, and that's how you did.
This wasn't a horror story.
This is real. This is real.
Well, so let's think about some of the differences here. So we have buy side and sell side issues, right? Braxton, what are some of the meaningful differences that we might find between a buy side due diligence process versus a sell side?
Yeah, we get this conversation a lot. Specifically, you know, most people that were coming to us years ago, you know, it was buy side primarily. And in the last few years, it's become, probably our work has become 50-50 between buyers and sellers. And one of the biggest things is, questions we get is, well, why would I pay for this as a seller when the buyer is going to come do their own diligence? And to me, it's a very easy answer. It's harder for some people to swallow because they have to put some investment up, right? But the biggest thing is going through, you know, the diligence process yourself, getting everything in order. So what we were just talking about is having everything organized. But as a CPA, you know, going through in the financial diligence that we perform, we're going through and making sure what are EBITDA add backs, identifying all these things long before we get a buyer in there that starts losing confidence if we can't provide things timely. You know, things you can control. One, you get your base EBITDA mostly, and that's what your price is going to be based on, and a multiple. Well, who gives me the high multiple? Who gives me the lower end of the multiple? That typically is being driven by buyers' confidence and outlook. You know, the less confidence you give them when a deal drags on for months and months. I've had deals that drag 2 years, and the reason for that is lack of preparedness. And so I think the key there is on the sell side. You know, why do that? Well, get the skeletons out of the closet. Know where your bodies are buried. Well, we'd be surprised the number of clients that don't know where their own bodies are buried. They forget where they've buried them. And so, getting all those things out there, sales tax is usually a big gotcha. You know, tax items, having those things in order, getting the right team in place. You know, spend the investment. It'll show a buyer that you're serious about it. You're not going to walk away after they spend all their money investing in, but really put the time in and the money, the investment to get the right attorneys in line, get your investment banker, get your accountants, and we can get everything lined up to where we're delivering a package with a bow on it, if you will, for the buyers to go in and analyze.
So in some respects, the sell side due diligence doesn't need to be any deeper than will the check clear the bank, right? I mean, isn't that the end of the day all we're after?
Oh yeah, that's absolutely all it is. But
Okay.
yeah, no, the sell side is definitely like, we'll run a full process. We would love to run a full process. Now, you have to look at the size of the deal as well. There's somewhere, you know, the deal doesn't make it worth probably the investment that you could make. We could spend hundreds of thousands of dollars just in accounting due diligence, but there's other things operationally, legally to make sure in order as well. But from a financial standpoint, I would say there's minimum things that you should do, the things we talked about just a bit ago, in addition to spending the time really creating your model, having everything ready to go, will save you time, and kind of basing that on what's our deal size.
Any other comments from the panelists?
Just a quick comment. Sell-side diligence can mean a lot, and one thing it can mean too is not every deal is, are you just getting cash
Yes.
from either the buyer or the investors? And sometimes buyers pay, if it's an M&A deal, they may pay for your company with their own stock, which in that case, you've got to decide if you want to buy that stock. And that would triggers a whole, you become an investor doing your due diligence too in them. And so that's something to think about. In a publicly disclosed transaction, we just represented last fall in Telebed and doing a combination transaction with Purple. And Purple paid for a lot of that deal with their stock. Now they're a public company, so they have publicly accessible documents, but still, Intelibed had to figure out and do some seller due diligence, a buyer, to figure out if they wanted to do that deal. So that's something to consider as well.
I would say too, even if you're not doing an acquisition, you should diligence the partner that you're going to work with. Diligence your investor. This is a very long relationship, and some of them can be very painful. So make sure you do your diligence on the company as well.
Beyond that, I think the last thing I would kind of add, rather than just the technical pieces of kind of to your point, Tara, of identifying what is your why of why you're selling your business and what you want that transaction to look like. But also, sometimes the highest price is not what every buyer wants. The highest buyer might not be the one that's going to perpetuate right with your employees. A lot of people care about their employees. Shocker, but they really do. And we've seen these business owners where they say, this might be the highest bidder, but also they're going to, not treat my team the way that they should, and I want to leave this business to them. Or maybe I want to run this through an ESOP. What are different vehicles that we want to do the deal?
So there are clearly some differences between the diligence process and expectations, whether it's a buy-side perspective or a sell-side. But there's differences in perspective based upon the type of investor as well, right? So Rick, I'm curious, what are some of the expectations of a seed round investor, and how might those be uniquely different from some of the expectations of an angel versus a venture capital versus an even more progressed type of investor?
So when you do due diligence under an M&A situation with a company like Tara's, it's like walking into a nice, clean, pristine office building. When you do due diligence with angel investors, it's the Wild West, right? We all have different ideas of what we're looking for and what's important. But to answer your question, Rick, I would say that predominantly the seed round angel investors are really predominantly evaluating the team. And more specifically, we're looking to evaluate the team's credibility, competency, and coachability. 3 C's. So let's talk about what we're looking for when we say credibility and the team's credibility. We want to understand what the founder's why is for even starting their business in the first place. We want to know how passionate the founder is about solving the problem that they've articulated in their problem solution hypothesis. We also want to know, is the founder really clear about the current state of their products and services and their technology and their marketing efforts? Clarity means a lot. So for example, don't exaggerate your tech. Make clear what's real and make clear what's under development. In other words, don't be Elizabeth Holmes. Also, don't exaggerate or obfuscate the financials. Make clear what's money in the bank, current revenues, etc. In other words, don't be SBF. And don't exaggerate your sales pipeline. Make clear who's a current client, a prospective client, and who's just a warm lead. We also, when it comes to credibility, want to understand things like who's the founder recruited as a board of directors and advisors, And are those people domain experts for the business? And we also want to know if the founders have skin in the game. And what is that? Is it money, time? What is there? That points to credibility as well. And lastly, we want to know who besides the founders and key leaders have already invested in your company. That'll display some credibility in the business. Now, when it comes to competency, what we're looking for there is what background and experience does the founder have in the business, the domain that they're in, and does the founder and the CEO have a solid handle on all aspects of their business? The market, the product development, the tech, the finances, the sales and marketing. This is one of the areas where I see founders fall down the most. At this stage in your company, it's not that complicated. It seems complicated, but it's not. You don't expect the CEO of an S&P 500 company, Fortune 500 company, to know all the details about their business. That's why they have executives and managers, et cetera. But at this stage, we really do expect the founders and the CEOs to have a handle and a good grasp on all the details with their business. We want to know if the other key team members demonstrate full knowledge and insights into their respective areas of responsibility. In other words, does the chief technology officer know what he's doing? And we want to see how the founder and the team interacts with each other. This is a big one. I've seen several of my own personal investment deals go south because people just couldn't get along. The relationship was unhealthy. And lastly, when it comes to competency, does the founder and the team understand the biggest challenges and hurdles that are facing them, and what's the plan to overcome those challenges? The third C is coachability. And this is pretty simple. Do the founders and the key leaders seek out mentoring and coaching from their current advisors, or are those advisors just advisors in name only? And we want to see if the founders and key leaders desire mentoring and coaching from their investors. Do they welcome suggestions and actually apply them when warranted? Because as angel investors, we want to contribute capital, obviously, but we also want to contribute our expertise, our background, our experiences in any way that we can to help the company. Because if we invest, we now have skin in the game. So we want to do what we can to help you. So we want to see if coachability is in your repertoire. So now that said, it's not having a solid team basically is the first step in due diligence, but it's not the only step, right? If you don't have a solid team, we're kind of done. There's no reason to really look beyond that. There's no reason to look into the tech or the finances or that sort of stuff. But if there is a solid team, now we're going to dive into the rest of that stuff in your data room that's well organized and updated. The tech, the finances, your sales and marketing strategy, your governance, that type of stuff. We can talk more about that later if there's time. But yeah, that's kind of the perspective from the angel investor standpoint on due diligence.
So it sounds like for the angel or seed round investor, you believe that the team, the human capital, is the most important element. Is that meaningfully different as we move on into venture investing, private equity investing, et cetera? And I'll throw this to any and all of you. And no one has an answer.
I didn't know who was going to go first. Yes, I think there's different focuses. Team is also very important to us. We've certainly killed deals on just not being able to, or we've killed deals on people. Like we found people that we wouldn't be able to work with. So we're choosy. I think the other thing that is important from an acquirer's perspective is that there's a strategic fit. You have a reason why you're seeking out these companies, and so the synergies have to be in place in order for us to make it. We also have additional requirements from an acquisition standpoint on profitability and revenue targets and the ability to grow and scale, and on also the ability for us to help you grow and scale. That's important to us as well. Cash flow. So I think from an acquisition standpoint, you know, there's going to be a variety of factors there that don't just focus on team, though team is a very important component. Back in venture days, so my background is also in venture and private equity. I worked at Mercado Partners for quite some time, was one of the first ones in. We also focused pretty heavily on who your customer was, making sure you understood them, making sure that you were selling to them correctly. We focused on intellectual property, depending on what type of company it was. So there's different focuses there for venture.
Yeah, the only thing I would add to that is, kind of agreeing that I think the team is super important. The finances, everything can make sense in the accounting, et cetera, sales, cash. But at the end of the day, we're dealing with people, and people obviously can make and break situations. And so I think you have to be the right fit. And sometimes one buyer and one seller aren't the right fit for each other. It's a marriage, if you will, when you're going together and doing this, and you want people you can trust and rely on.
Just a quick note on team. It's important all the time. In later stage financing, sometimes you'll see, in early pre-seed or seed level financings, you'll just see a deal not happen because maybe the investors don't like the team. In later stages, they might say, we'll do this deal, but this change needs to happen on the team. We'll see that happen quite a bit. The only other little brief point I'd make about seed level diligence is the company built in such a way that it can take a seed level financing? Has it been constructed in the right way? We can talk a little bit more about that, but that can sometimes really mess stuff up as well. So.
Well, my guess is we're going to come back to this if we have some time. So Sam, as equity investors, we talk a lot about the all-important cap table. So this is part of perhaps that data room that we're discussing. Why is the cap table or any other related documents to agreements, contracts, expectations, why are those so important? Isn't it just about the team and maybe a little bit about the product or service the company's dealing with and whether it has an EBIT?
Well, those are all super, super important, maybe even more important, but a cap table, having a cap table that works, a cap table that the investors can understand and they can use to figure out what's going to happen once they've invested and what they'll own is critical to it all happening in the end. Just a quick story, frankly, it's just today, I've started to work with a company that's been in business for several years in which they shared a cap table and it shows that preferred stock has been issued, which if you're familiar with emerging companies, you know that a lot of them have issued common stock to the founders and maybe early stage friends and family investors, and then more sophisticated investors typically buy preferred stock. Well, this company had issued on their cap table preferred stock, and so we went to check their charter documents, their articles of organization. This particular company was a Utah company, and they never filed a charter that created any preferred stock. So that means we had to tell them today that preferred stock you think you issued has never been issued. It doesn't exist. It's not real. Because you can't issue stock that you haven't created in your charter. So we'll figure out how to deal with that problem, but that shows one example, and an extreme one, of what can happen when there's a mess on the cap table. And a lot of companies, especially ones that have been around a while, it just seems to slip as the most important thing to worry about. So things do slip, and the cap table can end up being a mess, meaning you've got a name and a number of shares next to it on the cap table, but you don't have a document or a stock certificate or any evidence that those shares were actually ever issued. And when shares are issued to someone, a founder or other person who's expected to provide services to the company, that can generate significant tax issues for both the person and the company and can cause real problems. And so I can't tell you how many times I've heard a company say, this is founder Joe over here. I promised him 5% of the company when he started. It's 18 months later, and can you help us get him his shares? And he's just getting them to provide services. Well, Oh, and by the way, the company's grown a lot in those 18 months. It's got customers, it's generating revenue, all this is happening. Well, that company is now, let's say it's worth $10 million now, and when he started it was worth nothing. And if he wants 5% of the company, then how are we going to do that and not give him, 5% of $10 million in income to deal with? And those sorts of issues are always ones that end up raising a problem for early companies and even later ones that don't handle this stuff right. So if you can think about this issue, and a lot of people use tools like Carta or Figure now or Pulley or others to help manage the cap table online. I don't know what the right answer is for you, but you've got to do it right, both to manage, just so the cap table can look right and feel right to your investors, so you can avoid serious tax issues for founders and other service providers and for the company, and that you can comply with securities laws, because every time you give somebody stock, you've got to comply with both federal and state securities laws. And a lot of people do it without even thinking about that. And they may have a valid exemption from registration requirements, but they may not. So that's a whole other factor. So it's a good reason to talk to a lawyer early in the process, not to just say, you've got to hire me, but a lawyer somewhere who's done this before to help you make sure that stuff gets done right. Let me pause there.
I think from the angel investor standpoint, clearly, especially if we're coming in under a safe note or a convertible note, we obviously want to look at the cap table to find out, based on pre-money valuation caps, discounts, what have you, where would we fit in, right? Yep. That when we get to the point where Tara is acquiring your company. But the other reason why we want to see the cap table is we want to really know who has skin in the game and what benefit those folks can bring to your company, right? So are the advisors already in on the cap table? Are there people that have domain expertise that are showing us that they believe in you and your company because they've already invested money and taken a position on the cap table? So that's something else that we're looking for. And sort of the converse of that is, if we see people on the cap table that perhaps have other motivations for investing in that company, or want to take the company perhaps in a different direction than the founder might, we want to see how much influence they have via their ownership in the company. And quite frankly, that can kill a deal. If we see folks on the cap table that have varied motivations and interests in the company.
So we just have a few minutes left, and I'm kind of curious to some of your individual experiences here. So we've got the diversity of investor types and diversity of buy versus sell. Between the four of you, you've had some extraordinary experiences, and you've seen some gotchas. What are some of the gotchas you've experienced in due diligence? What are some of the surprises that have risen up to bite? And I'd love to hear one from each of you for a moment, if you don't mind.
Sales tax issues.
Yeah.
You stole mine.
Sorry.
Sales tax issues.
They come up a lot.
State and local tax. Mm-hmm. If a company's been selling somewhere, almost certainly they've messed something up in some state.
Yeah, we could spend another couple hours talking about sales tax, but that's usually our biggest thing. And just because you're not selling a product does not mean you don't have sales tax. There's services that are taxed. If you're in California, you're probably taxed for breathing. So you want to make sure that you've got everything in order, and often that's where we're finding issues. Now, we can work through that, and it's usually not an effect to EBITDA or something, because we can add that back. But it's another one of those things, let's get our arms around it before the buyer finds it, because the buyer finds that, they're like, okay, what else, right? And so getting those things in order.
So what you're referring to there isn't so much sales tax on this transaction you're dealing with at all. This is an issue of there's a sales tax liability that isn't obvious, but it's going to make itself such.
Yeah, and unfortunately, sometimes, I've seen one where, it was millions of dollars, and this deal, it wasn't a huge deal, but it ate into the sell price because that had to be escrowed to be paid out. They're like, well, they're not going to catch me, we haven't filed for however long. Well, Newco's going to go and start filing things, and then they're going to come ask, where have you been? And then you've got this big liability outstanding, and that eats into your purchase price, your cash at close.
Yeah, so during the due diligence process, maybe later on in transactions, you go through a quality of earnings. And during that quality of earnings, that's where a lot of the gotchas come out. And so sales tax issues, maybe inventory issues have also been a big one. Expired inventory or nearly expired inventory that comes out in some of the diligence process. So I would just say make your investor or your buyer very aware of any issues that you're aware of up front so that you don't delay or kill the transaction further down the line.
I've never not seen someone account for their inventory correctly.
Go ahead, Rick.
Yeah, Rick, for me, and this might be it was surprising to me, but to answer your question, the most surprising or shocking things that I have seen are founders who misrepresent their technology or their products and services in terms of how far along they are in development. We go through some screening processes before we get to due diligence, and the products have been represented to be at a certain point along in development. Hey, we're selling it, it's working, it's great, and then you get into due diligence and you realize it's all vaporware, and that is, in my book, that's a deal killer. It points to the credibility of the founder, and at that point, I'm done. And I'm surprised at how many times I've seen it.
What about you, Sam?
I would just add this generally, and of course companies sign agreements with customers or vendors or other people or licensors of intellectual property and that sort of thing. And I would just make the point that contracts that you cannot terminate soon, those are the ones you have to watch out for all the time. It's like if you're going to sign a contract that you cannot get out of, like a good example is a lease for office space, and generally you have to sign a contract for a term of years, and that's a basic example. Investors or buyers are going to understand you're going to have a lease, but you might have other contracts that they don't like, and you just have to say, sorry, I can't get out of this contract. I have to keep paying on it, or I have to keep doing business with them, or whatever. So I would just make sure that however you're processing your contracts, and by the way, make sure you get signed contracts. It's always in the due diligence process amazing how many contracts people have, but they cannot produce a signed copy of that contract. But apart from that, hopefully somebody is teaming up with somebody else, and maybe you need to talk to the board and whoever before you sign contracts that you cannot terminate in 90 days or less, because those are going to cause questions later in whatever due diligence you do.
Last point that I have on that, just kind of key takeaways for me would be in signing contracts, don't sign the LOI when someone comes to you immediately, because then you'll say, oh, I got this great offer, they threw this money at me, especially if you haven't run a process. Then you go to your attorney, you go over here and talk to Sam, and you've already signed the LOI, you've pretty well handcuffed him on what he can do. So take the LOI, thank them, call your attorney, call your investment bankers, call your accountants, run a process rather than locking yourself into something that you don't know what you just signed. You just saw a big dollar sign.
Just don't countersign.
Yeah, exactly.
So that's good advice. So we probably have time for one more question, and I'd like this to be about what is increasingly part of the acquisition process. we are dealing with companies more and more now where intellectual property is at the core of the company. It's not just a tangible product or a traditional service. So how can these emerging technology companies best prepare themselves for the IP due diligence that's necessary?
Well, let me take a first shot at it. Certainly some IP can be subject to patents or might be patentable. That's a long conversation we don't have time to get into, and I'm not a real true expert. But you need to have sort of a theory, a plan regarding IP and how you're planning to protect it to the extent you have protectable IP. So you need to have a story about that. Now, for most software companies or a lot of other companies, they may not have patents or registered copyrights or something like that. Most people end up filing trademarks, and that's one thing you need to do right too. But it's what is your secret sauce? What is special? And are you protecting it? Are you protecting the confidentiality of what may be trade secret or that sort of thing? And investors and buyers will look very closely to make sure your processes are in place, that you've got agreements signed with developers and other people that make sure it's clear that anything they do for you, you own, meaning your company owns. And is it clear that everything the founders did before they formed the company has been assigned properly to the company? Those are all key questions that you should spend some time thinking about and have a strategy to explain to guys like Rick, that you kind of want to know what their plan is on that, right?
Absolutely, 100% ditto all that. And then the one thing I would add is we're going to want to know and understand how reproducible your technology is, right? Because in the markets today, people can move pretty fast. Competition can come in pretty quickly. So if your business is centered around a piece of technology that's very easily reproducible, that's a negative from a seed round investor's standpoint. Versus if you've developed some, and I liked your word, special sauce, secret sauce technology, it's going to be very, very hard for people to come in and reproduce. That's something that we like to see, in addition to all the other things that you mentioned.
One thing I forgot, just to be clear on, a standard question, and this is very common in M&A, but also like a Series A financing or a Series C financing, is the investors want to know that anyone that's been involved in developing the technology of the company has signed a confidentiality agreement and an invention assignment agreement. And these may be people who have left the company that are long gone. And if you can't produce that contract, you might be going back to somebody who maybe you're not in the best of terms with and asking them to sign one, because they want to see it. They want to make sure anybody that has had anything to do with the technology of the company has signed one of those things. And I can't tell you how many times companies cannot deliver that. And that's part of your due diligence process, your evergreen processes. Do you have good confidentiality and invention assignment agreements in place with everyone?
Well, very good. So Tara, Braxton, Rick, and Sam, thank you for being with us today. And I know that the panelists and I each hope that this conversation has helped you understand some of the high points that you may want to be considering, helped you create some of the questions that you may need to have answered as you go through the due diligence process, as you help other companies go through it as well. I would like to thank again Kinect Capital, Silicon Slopes, and Savvi Legal for inviting us to be here and hosting this today. Thank you.
Thank you all so much for joining. Another round of applause for our amazing panelists. Hey, Rick, you have a job as moderator. You did such a great job handling.
I think the Tonight Show's hiring too.
I know.
I want to make sure that you all are witness to the fact that she just offered me a job. So.
But I like the way you hold the mic. I want you to rap next time. I'd also like to give a very special thanks to all the people who are working behind the scenes today. First, Dave Meekum with Silicon Slopes. Also, we have Ray Smithson over here in the back, hanging tough with all of the technical. And I'd like to say thank you to Peter Collister, Christina Neild. Also, huge thank you for joining us to Boise, Idaho. Norris Kruger, Becky, Melanie, thank you so much for being with us. We had over 76 people join us live today, so this is pretty amazing. We're going to conclude now, followed by an hour of meet and greets. Please come up, meet the experts, and introduce yourselves, and let's keep the conversations going. Thank you so much.